On a Tuesday morning in late November, in a county courthouse outside St. Louis, a black widow named Patrice Hollis walked through metal detectors with exactly $2,300 in her checking account and a file folder that felt heavier than grief. To the clerks behind the glass, to the lawyers in tailored suits, to the judge who was already scanning the docket with impatience, Patrice looked like what they expected: tired, quiet, alone. Another woman with paperwork, another probate issue, another person who would leave the same way she came in, small, unseen, and unheard. But that morning, a ledger would speak for her. Not a speech, not a plea, not tears. A ledger, page after page of dates, signatures, amounts, and bank stamps. The kind of evidence that doesn't care who you are, what you look like, or how much power the other side has. And when that ledger hit the light, the courtroom would go silent. This is a story about dignity, about how theft can hide behind paperwork, about how institutions can turn grief into revenue, and about what happens when a widow stops begging to be believed and starts proving it. Patrice Hollis hadn't always been a widow. She'd been a wife who believed in routine, the kind of woman who made coffee the same way every morning and folded laundry into neat rectangles because order kept her calm. She'd been married to Leon Hollis for 19 years. He was a city bus mechanic, hands always smelling faintly of oil, shoulders broad from lifting what other people couldn't. He was the man who fixed things, not just engines, broken sinks, stuck doors, bad moods. They had one child, a son named Malcolm, now 15. Quiet, observant, the kind of boy who didn't talk much but listened to everything. Leon used to tell him, "Pay attention, people show you who they are if you watch long enough." 2 years ago, on a Friday night that started like any other, Leon collapsed in their kitchen. It wasn't dramatic, no final words, no warning. One moment, he was laughing at something Malcolm said, and the next moment, his hand slipped off the counter as if his body had simply decided it was done. The ambulance came fast. The paramedics worked hard. But Leon was gone before Patrice could even hold his face and tell him it wasn't time. The death certificate said sudden cardiac event. The hospital gave Patrice a pamphlet about grief counseling. The funeral home offered affordable packages with payment plans, and the world, the next morning, kept moving like nothing had happened. Patrice didn't have the luxury of falling apart. She worked as a night custodian at a public high school. Not glamorous, not easy, but steady. She mopped hallways that other people walked through without ever thinking about who cleaned them. She emptied trash cans filled with the remains of lunches and broken pencils and casual entitlement. Leon's paycheck had been the anchor. With him gone, Patrice's life became math. Rent, utilities, groceries, Malcolm's school expenses, the car note, the health insurance she couldn't afford but feared living without. And then there were the fees. Not bills, fees. Fees that arrived in envelopes with official seals and language designed to make you feel ignorant if you didn't understand it. Fees that didn't care you were grieving. Fees that didn't care. You were working nights and raising a teenager and trying to sleep in 4-hour increments. Because when someone dies, institutions show up like vultures, quiet, formal, and hungry. Leon had a small life insurance policy through his union, $50,000. Enough to cover the funeral, wipe out a few debts, and keep Patrice afloat while she adjusted. Leon had also been careful. He kept a notebook, an old thick ledger he'd bought years ago at an office supply store. He called it the book. Every month, Leon wrote down what came in and what went out: rent, utilities, insurance, car repairs, groceries, school supplies, even small cash withdrawals. Patrice used to tease him. "You know we got bank apps now, right?" Leon would grin. "Bank apps can glitch. People can lose records. Paper don't glitch." Patrice didn't understand then how prophetic that was. After Leon died, Patrice did what she was told to do, what the funeral director and the bank and the county clerk all said was standard. Open probate, transfer accounts, file documents, pay administrative fees. She wasn't asking for anything extravagant. She just wanted what Leon left behind to go where it was supposed to go, to his wife and son. But in the world of probate court, there's always someone ready to tell you that your grief is a process, and processes cost money. The attorney assigned to her case wasn't hers exactly. His name was Gerald Winslow, and he came recommended by a family friend who was really a distant cousin Patrice barely knew. Winslow wore expensive cologne and spoke in calm tones that made everything sound manageable. "Mrs. Hollis," he said in their first meeting, "we'll get you through this. Probate is just paperwork, but you have to follow the rules." Patrice nodded. "I just want to take care of my son." "Of course," Winslow said, smiling, "and that's exactly why we need to do everything properly. No shortcuts." Then he slid her a retainer agreement, $2,300. Patrice stared at it like it was written in another language. "Mr. Winslow," she said carefully, "I don't have that." Winslow's smile stayed. "Mrs. Hollis, you have a life insurance policy coming. And you have assets that will be transferred. This is a standard fee." "My husband just died," Patrice whispered. "I'm paying funeral bills." Winslow nodded as if he understood. "I'm sympathetic, but the court doesn't run on sympathy." He said it like it was wisdom, not cruelty. Patrice didn't pay him that day. She went home, stared at Leon's empty chair, and tried to figure out how to survive a system designed for people who never had to ask, "Can I afford this?" Then something else happened, something that turned the fee into a weapon. 2 weeks after Leon's death, Patrice received a letter from Winslow's office stating that a temporary administration had been filed to protect estate assets. The letter also stated that court costs and administrative fees were accruing daily, and that failure to pay the retainer could jeopardize timely disbursement. Patrice didn't understand it, but she understood the fear underneath it. Jeopardize, delay, accruing. Those words weren't neutral. They were pressure. Patrice called the office. "I got a letter," she said. "What does this mean?" Winslow's assistant sighed on the phone like Patrice was an inconvenience. "It means your case is pending. We can't proceed until the retainer is paid." Patrice swallowed. "I don't have it." "Then it will delay," the assistant said. "And the court doesn't like delays." Patrice hung up and felt something in her chest tighten. Then came the second letter. This one said something even worse, that a contested creditor claim had been filed against Leon's estate, alleging unpaid fees related to property maintenance services from 2020. It was a lie. Patrice knew it instantly. They'd never hired any property maintenance service. Leon fixed things himself, but the claim came with an invoice and a name: Armitage Property Solutions. Patrice searched the company online. Bare bones website, no real reviews. A phone number that went to voicemail. Her instincts flared. She drove to the county clerk's office, waited in line, and asked for a copy of the creditor claim file. The clerk printed it and slid it across the counter. Patrice stared at the signature line. The signature on the invoice looked like Leon's name, but it wasn't his handwriting. Patrice's mouth went dry. Someone had forged her dead husband's signature, and the court had accepted it. That's when Patrice opened Leon's ledger. She'd been avoiding it because it felt like touching him, like opening a door to grief she couldn't afford to drown in. But now she needed facts. Leo's handwriting filled the pages, dates, amounts, notes like Malcolm shoes and car brake pads and union dues. Patrice flipped to 2020. No payments to Armitage, no checks, no cash withdrawals matching the invoice amounts, nothing. Patrice felt a sharp clarity. If someone forged Leon's signature to file a creditor claim, then someone was trying to drain the estate before Patrice could receive it. And suddenly, the $2,300 retainer wasn't just a fee. It was a gate between Patrice and her own protection. So Patrice did what most people don't do when they're overwhelmed and scared. She started documenting. She requested copies of everything: filings, claims, invoices, letters, docket entries. She stapled them into chronological order. She made a spreadsheet on an old laptop. She wrote down every phone call, date, time, name, what was said. And every night, after Malcolm went to bed, Patrice sat at her kitchen table with Leon's ledger open beside her, comparing every claim to the reality of their life. The numbers didn't match, and the more Patrice dug, the more she realized the problem wasn't just one fraudulent creditor claim. It was a system, a network of small, plausible drains designed to look like normal probate costs while stripping estates from families who couldn't fight back. Patrice began talking to other widows she met in the courthouse hallway. Quiet conversations, whispered advice, shared frustration. One older woman with trembling hands told her, "They did it to my sister. Took her husband's settlement through fees. She didn't understand the paperwork. They counted on that." Another said, "They're always polite until you ask questions." Patrice listened, and she learned the most dangerous truth in that courthouse. There were two kinds of people in probate court: people who had lawyers, and people who were treated like prey. Patrice decided she wouldn't be prey. But she still had a problem. Her hearing was coming, and Judge Carlton Breyer, known for moving cases along, didn't have patience for people who slowed down the machine. Judge Breyer was in his 60s, with a sharp jaw and a sharper voice. He had a reputation in the courthouse hallways. If you came unprepared, he'd humiliate you. If you came emotional, he'd dismiss you. If you didn't speak legal, he'd treat you like you didn't belong in his courtroom. Patrice knew that type of man, not personally, but spiritually. The kind who thinks power is proof of correctness. The kind who sneers at questions, because questions threaten the comfort of certainty. On the morning of the hearing, Patrice wore her best outfit: a plain black dress, a coat, simple shoes with a heel low enough to keep her steady. She carried Leon's ledger in a manila envelope along with a stack of documents she'd organized carefully: bank statements, union paperwork, life insurance policy documentation, and copies of every filing in the probate case. She sat in the courtroom and watched attorneys joke quietly with clerks, watched bailiffs laugh with staff, watched how comfortable everyone looked in a place that made Patrice's stomach churn. When her case was called, she stood. "Estate of Leon Hollis," the clerk announced. Patrice approached the front alone. Gerald Winslow stood at the other table, crisp suit, confident posture, like he belonged there. The judge glanced down. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, sounding tired already. "You're representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Breyer looked at Winslow. "Mr. Winslow, you're listed as counsel of record?" Winslow smiled. "Your Honor, I was retained to assist with probate administration, but Mrs. Thaber Hollis has not paid the required retainer. We cannot proceed without addressing outstanding fees." The judge sighed, already irritated. "Mrs. Hollis, is that accurate?" Patrice lifted her chin. I have not paid $2,300 because I cannot afford it. I have a minor child. I have funeral expenses. And I have reason to believe there is fraud in this case." The word fraud made the courtroom shift. Judge Breyer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Fraud?" "Yes, Your Honor. A creditor claim has been filed with a forged signature." Winslow's expression hardened. "Your Honor, these are allegations from an unrepresented party who doesn't understand the process. Creditors file claims routinely. If she disputes it, there are procedures." "I do understand the process," Patrice said. Her voice didn't shake. "And I have documentation." Judge Breyer leaned back, looking at Patrice the way people look at someone who's taking up too much space. "Mrs. Hollis," he said slowly, "you're here about a probate matter, not to put on a show. The court cannot operate on feelings and suspicion." Patrice's jaw tightened. "I'm not operating on feelings." Breyer sighed. "Then pay your counsel. $2,300 isn't an astronomical amount. This court sees real hardship every day." The words landed like a slap because Patrice knew what he meant. He meant, "You're not special." He meant, "Stop complaining." He meant, "Your grief isn't valuable." Patrice's voice stayed calm. "Your Honor, $2,300 is my rent and groceries for a month." Judge Breyer's mouth tightened. Then with a faint sneer he said, "Then perhaps you should have considered that before coming to court without representation." The courtroom went quiet. Patrice felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she didn't let it spill. Winslow looked satisfied, like the judge had said exactly what he wanted said. Judge Breyer tapped his pen. "Mrs. the Single. Hollis, if you cannot pay your attorney, you may not be able to proceed efficiently. The estate assets can be used for court-approved fees. This is standard." Patrice's heart thudded, because she heard what he was really saying. The estate will pay. The estate will be drained. The machine will feed itself. That's when Patrice opened her envelope. She didn't slam it down. She didn't raise her voice. She simply removed Leon's ledger and held it in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, steady, "my husband kept detailed financial records. This ledger covers every payment, every expense, every withdrawal. The creditor claim submitted does not match his records. The signature does not match his handwriting, and I have bank statements to prove no payment was ever made to the company claiming the debt." Judge Breyer stared at the book like it was an inconvenience. "Mrs. W. Hollis," he said, voice sharper now, "a handwritten notebook is not evidence in itself." Patrice nodded. "It becomes evidence when it matches the bank records." She turned to the bailiff. "May I approach the bench with copies?" Breyer opened his mouth to refuse, but something in Patrice's posture, her calm, her precision, made him hesitate. He was used to tears. He was used to chaos. He was used to people stumbling. He wasn't used to a widow with receipts. "Approach," he said curtly. Patrice walked forward and placed copies on the bench. Leon's ledger entries, highlighted, bank statements with corresponding dates, and the creditor claim invoice. Judge Breyer glanced down. Then he paused. He leaned closer. His eyes moved across the page more carefully. Patrice stood silently, watching him read. Winslow shifted at his table, suddenly less relaxed. The judge looked up. "Mrs. Hollis," he said slowly, "how did you obtain these bank statements?" Patrice answered plainly, "From the bank, Your Honor, officially requested, stamped copies." The judge looked back at the papers, then he did something that changed the room. He asked the clerk to bring the court file forward. The clerk did. Breyer compared the invoice signature to a scanned copy of Leon's driver's license signature in the file. The room was so quiet you could hear paper edges scraping. Breyer's jaw tightened. Because anyone with eyes could see it. It wasn't a match. Winslow cleared his throat. Your Honor, signatures vary. Stress. Breyer held up a hand. Mr. Winslow, not yet. Patrice felt her pulse pounding, but she kept her face neutral. Breyer flipped to another page Patrice had provided, a ledger entry from the week the invoice claimed services rendered, with a note in Leon's handwriting, fixed sink, myself. No. Contractor. Breyer's eyes narrowed. He looked at Patrice. Mrs. Hollis, do you have reason to believe this creditor claim was fabricated? Yes, Your Honor. Do you have reason to believe someone filed it intentionally to drain the estate? Yes. Breyer looked at Winslow. Winslow's smile was gone now. Your Honor, I have no connection to this alleged creditor. I'm counsel assisting. Breyer interrupted. Then you won't mind if I ask you a question? Winslow stiffened. Of course not. Breyer leaned forward. Why did your office send Mrs. Hollis a letter stating that probate? Administration could not proceed without your retainer, while simultaneously filings were made to appoint a temporary administrator. Winslow blinked. Your Honor, that's standard protective procedure. Breyer's voice sharpened. Protective for whom? The room held its breath. Patrice stood still, feeling something shift. Not victory, not yet, but movement. Breyer looked back down at the papers. Then he said, almost to himself, $2,300. He looked up again. Mrs. Z. Hollis, you said that was all you had. Yes, Your Honor. Breyer nodded slowly. Then he turned to the clerk. Schedule an evidentiary hearing on the creditor claim immediately. Issue a subpoena for bank records and any corporate documentation for Armitage Property Solutions. Also, I want the court's investigator to review filings in this case. Winslow's face drained slightly. Breyer wasn't done, and I'm ordering a temporary freeze on estate disbursements pending fraud review. The courtroom shifted again. People sat up straighter. The air changed from routine to danger. Patrice swallowed. Breyer looked at her. His expression softened, not into kindness, but into something like reluctant respect. Mrs. Hollis, he said, you may not have counsel, but you came prepared. Patrice didn't smile. She simply nodded. I had to. Breyer looked at Winslow. Mr. Winslow, you are to provide a full accounting of all fees charged, requested, or communicated to Mrs. Hollis in this matter. Winslow's voice tightened. Your Honor, today, Breyer said. Winslow's jaw clenched. Yes, Your Honor. Patrice walked out of that courtroom with her knees shaking, but her spine straighter. She hadn't won, not yet, but she'd forced the system to look at her. And that was the first battle. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for 9 days later. In those 9 days, Patrice became someone she didn't recognize, someone sharper, more methodical, more relentless. She requested the creditor's corporate filings. She called the Secretary of State's office. She learned how to search business registrations. She looked for names, addresses, registered agents. Armitage Property Solutions, it turned out, had an address that led to a UPS store mailbox, and the registered agent's name led to another business. And that business name led to another. It was like following a trail of threads stitched to hide a wound. Patrice didn't sleep much. She couldn't afford to. Malcolm needed dinner, homework help, a mother who didn't collapse. Patrice worked her night shift cleaning classrooms. Then she came home and built her case in the hours most people used to rest. Sometimes she would pause and stare at Leon's ledger, his handwriting steady and familiar. It felt like he was still speaking to her, guiding her through numbers. One night, Malcolm woke up and found her at the kitchen table. "Mom," he said, voice sleepy, "why you still up?" Patrice looked at him, softening. "Go back to bed, baby." He rubbed his eyes. "You scared?" Patrice hesitated. Then she told the truth, not the full truth, but enough. "I'm fighting," she said quietly, "for your dad." Malcolm looked at the ledger. "That's Dad's book." Patrice nodded. "And is telling the truth." He stared for a moment, then said something that made Patrice's throat tighten. "Dad always said paper don't lie." Patrice swallowed. "Yeah," she whispered, "he did." The evidentiary hearing was packed. Not with the public probate court wasn't usually interesting, but with people who worked in that courthouse. Clerks, bailiffs, junior attorneys. People who understood that when a judge orders subpoenas and investigations, it means someone important might fall. Gerald Winslow walked in with a new posture, less smug, more defensive. He had another attorney with him now, someone older, someone who looked like a fixer. Patrice stood alone at her table, holding her stack of documents like armor. Judge Breyer took the bench and immediately looked different. Not bored, focused. "This court is here to review the validity of creditor claim filed by Armitage Property Solutions," Breyer said, "and the conduct surrounding the probate administration." He turned to the investigator. "Proceed." The investigator laid out initial findings, the company's mailbox address, its minimal corporate footprint, its pattern of filing claims in probate cases involving unrepresented families, and the signature discrepancy on Leon's alleged invoice. Breyer listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Patrice. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, "you submitted additional exhibits." "Yes, Your Honor. Summarize them." Patrice took a breath and did what she trained herself to do. She spoke like the numbers spoke. Armitage's registered agent is listed as Martin Keene. That name is also listed as registered agent for a company called Keene Administrative Services. That company's address matches the same mailbox location. Keene Administrative Services filed claims in 3 other probate cases, all within the last year, all disputed. Winslow's attorney stood quickly. "Objection. Relevance." Breyer didn't even look at him. "Overruled. Continue." Patrice's voice stayed calm. "Additionally, the invoice submitted claims maintenance services performed at my home in May 2020. The invoice lists an incorrect street number. Our address is 4127. The invoice lists 4172. A transposition error. Someone who didn't know our address created that invoice." A few people in the courtroom shifted. Patrice continued. "My husband's ledger shows no payments to Armitage, no checks, no cash withdrawals matching the invoice amount. The bank statements corroborate that, and the signature does not match." Breyer leaned forward. "What is your conclusion, Mrs. Hollis?" Patrice didn't hesitate. "The claim is fraudulent." Breyer turned to Winslow. "Mr. Winslow, you were counsel of record when this claim was introduced." Winslow's throat tightened. "Yes, Your Honor, but I did not file." Breyer held up a hand. "Not what I asked. Did you advise the estate to honor the claim?" Winslow's lawyer answered quickly. "Your Honor, counsel provided general guidance." Breyer's eyes snapped toward him. "I asked Mr. Winslow." Winslow swallowed. "Yes, I advised it should be reviewed." Breyer's voice sharpened. "Reviewed by whom?" Winslow hesitated. "Because the answer mattered. Reviewed by a temporary administrator, someone Winslow's office had tried to install." Breyer turned to the investigator. "Provide the court with the relationship between Winslow's office and the proposed administrator." The investigator did. And that's when the room truly changed. Because the proposed temporary administrator wasn't a neutral party. He was affiliated with a probate services company that had shared office space with Winslow's firm, shared reception, shared fax line, the same building, same floor. Different names, Patrice felt her stomach drop, not from fear this time, but from the realization that she had stepped into something organized. Breyer's jaw tightened as he listened. Then he said, "This court finds probable cause to believe the creditor claim is fraudulent. It is dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, this court orders a referral to the county prosecutor for investigation of potential fraud and collusion in probate administration." Winslow's lawyer stood. "Your Honor," Breyer's gavel hit the wood. "I'm not finished," Breyer said. He looked at Patrice. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, "you are hereby appointed personal representative of the estate without requirement of counsel. The court will provide you with a legal aid referral for assistance, but you will not be compelled to retain private counsel." Patrice's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." Breyer turned to Winslow. "Mr. Sopin." "Winslow, you are ordered to provide a complete accounting of communications, retainer requests, filings, and fee discussions related to this case and any overlapping cases with Armitage or Keene Administrative Services." Winslow's face went pale. Breyer's voice dropped. "If you fail to comply, you will be held in contempt." The courtroom was silent. Patrice stood still, feeling the weight of it. The judge who had sneered at her over a fee was now ordering investigations that could ruin careers. Not because he'd become kind, because Patrice had forced him to confront evidence he could not ignore. Outside the courthouse that day, Ms. Alvarez, the clerk with tired shoulders, caught Patrice in the hallway. "Hollis," she said softly, "you did something today." Patrice exhaled. "I just told the truth." Alvarez shook her head. "No, you did more. You made them listen." Patrice blinked back sudden tears. "I didn't have a choice." Alvarez's voice dropped even lower. "Neither did the others. But they didn't have you." Patrice paused. "Others?" Alvarez hesitated, then leaned closer. "There are more cases, more widows, more estates. People don't fight because they don't know how." Patrice felt her chest tighten. "How many?" Alvarez looked away. "Too many." And just like that, Patrice understood the true shape of the monster. It wasn't one fake invoice. It was a pipeline, and she had stepped in front of it. In the weeks that followed, Patrice's life became a strange split screen. At night, she cleaned classrooms. In the day, she spoke to investigators, lawyers, and legal aid counsel. A legal aid attorney named Simone Park took her case pro bono. Simone was small, sharp-eyed, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had devoted her life to fighting systems that ate people alive. "You did what most attorneys don't do," Simone told Patrice in their first meeting. "You organized the truth." Patrice nodded. "I didn't do it to be impressive. I did it because they were lying." Simone leaned forward. "And they thought you wouldn't notice." Patrice's mouth tightened. "They thought I was too broke, too tired, too alone." Simone nodded. "That's how this works. Predators don't pick strong prey." Patrice's eyes hardened. Then they picked wrong. Simone helped Patrice file motions to compel production of records, bank deposit histories, email communications, phone logs, office sharing agreements, the kinds of records people assume nobody will ever request. But now they were being requested and court-ordered. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation, quiet at first, then louder when the patterns became undeniable. Armitage Property Solutions, Keene Administrative Services, and a third entity called Clarion Probate Consultants had filed claims across multiple estates. Many of the claims were small, 800, 1,600, 2,900, amounts large enough to hurt a family, small enough not to trigger immediate suspicion. They targeted people who didn't have counsel, They moved quickly after deaths, before families understood the process. They used intimidation language, accruing, jeopardize, failure to comply. And when families couldn't pay attorneys, the system nudged them toward temporary administrators who happened to be affiliated with the same network. It was theft dressed in formal language. It was grief monetized. And the ledger Patrice brought into court was the crack in the dam. One afternoon, Simone called Patrice. Her voice was tight. "Patrice, I need you to sit down." Patrice's stomach flipped. "What?" "They found something," Simone said. "An internal email from Winslow's office." Patrice's hands went cold. "What does it say?" Simone read it slowly. "Client, Hollis. Widow resistant. Declined retainer. Recommend pressure letter and creditor review. If she stalls, proceed temporary admin to stabilize assets." Patrice felt bile rise in her throat. They had discussed her like she was a problem to manage, not a grieving wife, a target. Simone continued. "And there's another email from 2019. It references Armitage claim package and signature template. Patrice, they were forging signatures." Patrice stared at her kitchen wall like it was moving. She had known, emotionally, that they were lying. But hearing it in writing did something else. It turned betrayal into fact. It made it real. And once something is real, it demands consequences. The prosecutor's office issued warrants. Winslow's office was raided on a Thursday morning. Cameras outside the building, reporters hungry. Boxes carried out, computers seized, files labeled with names of dead men and grieving women. Patrice watched the news footage with Malcolm beside her. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "They did that to Dad?" Patrice swallowed. "They tried." Malcolm looked at Leon's ledger on the shelf. "Dad saved us." Patrice blinked hard. "Yeah," she whispered, "he did." The case exploded. Not because Patrice wanted attention, but because people who had been hurt finally realized they weren't alone. Widows and widowers began calling legal aid. A local pastor spoke from his pulpit about probate predators. A community organizer held a meeting at the church basement where families shared stories that sounded eerily similar. Fake creditors, pressure letters, lawyers demanding retainers while filing to take control. Small sums that destroyed fragile lives. Patrice attended one meeting quietly, sitting in the back. A woman near the front, older, hands shaking, spoke into a microphone. "My husband died last year," she said. "They told me I owed $3,000 to a company I never heard of. I paid because I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." Her voice cracked. "I sold my car to pay it." Patrice's throat tightened. Another man spoke. "My mom died. They said her estate owed money for estate cleaning services. Nobody cleaned anything. I paid because they said probate would freeze if I didn't." Story after story, a choir of quiet suffering, finally audible. And Patrice realized something that made her both proud and furious. Her case wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been told their grief was an opportunity. The grand jury indicted Gerald Winslow on charges including conspiracy, fraud, and aiding and abetting forgery. His license was suspended permanently pending trial. Clarion Probate Consultants owner was arrested. Martin Keene, the registered agent, was charged with identity theft and document forgery. The judge, who had sneered at Patrice over $2,300, now presided over pre-trial hearings with a face like stone. He didn't look at Patrice with disdain anymore. He looked at her like a person who had seen the truth and refused to blink. But the fight wasn't over, because men like Winslow don't go down quietly. His defense strategy was simple. blame the consultants, claim ignorance, portray Patrice as confused and emotional. At one pre-trial hearing, Winslow's attorney said, "My client offered standard legal services. He cannot be responsible for a third-party creditor's misrepresentations." Simone stood and responded with cold clarity. "Your Honor," she said, "the evidence includes internal emails referring to claim packages and signature templates. This was not passive. This was coordinated." Breyer's gaze didn't waver. "We'll see it at trial," he said. Patrice sat in the gallery, hands folded, heart pounding. She knew what trials did to people like her. They made your life public. They made your grief evidence. They made you relive everything. But Patrice also knew something else now. She wasn't alone. She had Simone. She had Malcolm. She had the truth. And she had a ledger with Leon's handwriting that had already changed the course of the case once. The trial began the following summer. Patrice sat in the front row every day she could, taking off work when possible, covering shifts when she couldn't. The courtroom was packed, not with random spectators, but with families, victims, people who had paid fake claims and swallowed shame. The prosecutor laid out the scheme carefully, establish fake companies, file small creditor claims, pressure widows and families into payment, use affiliated administrators to control estates, funnel money through layered accounts. They showed bank records. They showed office leases. They showed communications. Then Simone was called as a witness for the state because she had first-hand knowledge of Patrice's documentation and the chain of events that exposed the operation. But the moment that changed everything again was Patrice's testimony. She took the stand in a plain dress, hands steady, voice controlled. The prosecutor asked her to explain what she'd found. Patrice described the fake invoice, the forged signature, the pressure letter, the retainer demand. Then she held up Leon's ledger. "My husband wrote in this," she said. "Every month, every bill, every expense." He didn't do it because he was paranoid. He did it because he believed numbers should tell the truth. The prosecutor asked, "What did the ledger show about the alleged debt?" Patrice answered calmly, "That it never existed. No payment, no withdrawal, no vendor, nothing. Just a lie on paper." The defense attorney tried to rattle her. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, "you're not a lawyer, correct?" "No." "You're not an accountant?" "No." "So you interpreted these documents yourself?" Patrice looked at him. "I read them." He smirked. "And you believe that makes you qualified to accuse professionals of fraud?" Patrice didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She said, "I believe it makes me qualified to know my husband didn't sign something he didn't sign." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The defense tried again. "You were emotional after your husband died, weren't you?" Patrice held his gaze. "I was grieving. That doesn't make me blind." He leaned forward. "Isn't it possible you're mistaken about what he would have paid?" Patrice's voice stayed even. "No, because he wrote it down." The defense attorney scoffed. "A notebook isn't proof." Patrice turned slightly toward the jury. "It is when it matches the bank stamp," she said. The prosecutor entered the corroborating bank records, time-stamped withdrawals, deposit logs, the absence of any transfer to the fake creditor. The defense fell quiet, because evidence does not negotiate. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like years to Patrice. Malcolm sat beside her, knee bouncing. Simone sat on the other side, calm but alert, eyes scanning every movement in the courtroom like she was still fighting even in silence. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud," the foreperson said, "we find the defendant guilty. Patrice's breath caught. More charges, more guilty verdicts. Winslow's face went pale, then hardened into rage. But rage didn't change the words. Guilty. In sentencing, the judge spoke directly. "This court exists to administer justice," Breyer said, "not to facilitate exploitation." The defendants in this case used grief as leverage and paperwork as a weapon. They targeted vulnerable families and attempted to drain estates through fraud. He paused, looking at Winslow. "Mr. Winslow, as an officer of the court, you had a duty. You violated that duty." He sentenced Winslow to prison time and restitution. Not enough to restore every stolen dollar, but enough to mark a boundary. This is not acceptable. After sentencing, Patrice stood outside the courthouse in sunlight, the air warm, the sky clear. Reporters asked questions. Microphones appeared. Patrice could have made a speech. She didn't. She simply said the truth. "They thought $2,300 would silence me," she said. "They thought I was too tired to fight. But my husband left me something stronger than money." A reporter asked, "What was that?" Patrice answered, "A record." She held up Leon's ledger. "And when you have a record," she said, "you have a voice." The county announced a restitution fund for victims of probate fraud. Families were contacted. Claims reviewed. Some money recovered, some not. But policy changes were implemented. Automatic legal aid referrals for low-income probate cases. Stricter verification for creditor claims. Mandatory signature authentication for disputed documents. Oversight for temporary administrators. The county estimated the reforms would affect hundreds of families each year. Patrice didn't become rich. She didn't become famous. She did become something else. She became steady again. She paid down debt. She kept Malcolm in the same school. She built a small emergency fund, something she'd never had in her life. She continued community college, taking accounting classes one by one. And on the anniversary of Leon's death, Patrice and Malcolm visited his grave with a small bouquet and the ledger tucked in Patrice's bag like a sacred thing. Malcolm stood quietly, hands in his pockets. After a moment he said, "Dad would have liked what you did." Patrice swallowed. "I wish he didn't have to." Malcolm nodded. "But he taught you." Patrice looked at the headstone, then down at the grass, then up at the sky. "He did," she whispered. "He taught me to write it down." Years later, Patrice would tell other widows what she'd learned, not as a motivational slogan, as survival instructions. Get copies, request records, write down times and names. Don't trust anyone to protect you just because they have a title, because titles are sometimes camouflage, and grief is sometimes bait. But Patrice had also learned something else, something quieter and deeper. The system didn't change because it suddenly grew a conscience. It changed because someone made the truth impossible to ignore. And that someone was a widow with $2,300 and a ledger. This story reminds us that dignity is not what people in power allow you to have. Dignity is what you refuse to surrender when they treat your hardship like an inconvenience. Patrice Hollis walked into court and was sneered at over a fee like her life was a nuisance. But she walked out having triggered an investigation that exposed a fraud network feeding on grieving families. Not because she was loud, because she was prepared, because she had receipts, because she had the courage to keep showing up, and because she understood something powerful people forget: truth becomes unstoppable when it's documented. So ask yourself, what would you do if you were Patrice? If someone tried to tax your grief? If a system built on confusion tried to pressure you into paying money you don't have? Would you fold? Would you sign? Would you walk away? Or would you do the hardest thing, stand still, open your folder, and make them show their math? Patrice didn't become a celebrity. She got something better. She got security. She got justice. She got the chance to raise her son without being drained by liars in suits. And she got to honor her husband, not with words, but with the very thing he believed in most, a record that told the truth. This story is a fictional dramatization inspired by real events of exploitation, legal intimidation, and the power of human dignity. In a world that often rewards greed and punishes the grieving, choose to be like Patrice Hollis. Choose persistence. Choose clarity. Choose grace. And when someone tries to steal from you with paperwork, don't just protest, document. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring into a courtroom isn't a lawyer, it's the truth written down.